Hello and welcome back to Sleepy Saga Histories. Tonight we embark on a journey of the great Roman Empire. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as one of the most enduring and influential civilizations in human history. From a modest cluster of huts beside the Tiber River, it expanded to span 3 continents, ruling over deserts, forests, coasts and plains. It left behind roads and aqueducts, walls and ruins, languages and laws. But Rome was not built in a day, nor by accident. Its empire was the product of deliberate strategy, slow adaptation, and centuries of reform, military conquest, and administrative control. To understand how the Romans built an empire, we must begin not with emperors or conquests, but with myths. Myths that whispered of destiny in the winds of Latium, that breathed through the reeds of the Tiber River. The tale begins with twin infants, Romulus and Remus, abandoned, suckled by a she-wolf, and raised to one day found a city that would, in time, rule the known world. This myth, whether believed or not by the Romans themselves, became the symbolic bedrock of Roman identity. It taught resilience, struggle, divine favour and violence, themes that would echo through every century of Rome's ascent. The city, so the myth goes, was founded in 753 BCE by Romulus after a fratricidal act that cast Remus into legend. Romulus became the first of 7 kings who would rule over the early Roman kingdom. The historical record of the Roman kingdom is sparse and clouded by legend, but archaeology confirms that in the 8th century BCE, a cluster of small settlements on the Palatine Hill began to merge. These villages, little more than mud huts with thatched roofs, coalesced into a proto-urban centre that began to exploit its strategic position, not by sea, but along the river Tiber, a vital trade route connecting Etruria in the north to the Greek cities of southern Italy. Rome was never isolated. From its earliest years it absorbed influences, Etruscan religious rituals and engineering, Latin customs, and Sabine military practices. The last 3 kings, all of Etruscan lineage, turned Rome from a collection of huts into a city of temples, stone buildings, and paved roads. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, dates from this time, showing a city beginning to flex infrastructural muscle. Yet the monarchy fell, not from foreign invasion, but from internal strife. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was expelled in 509 BCE after his son's alleged rape of the noblewoman Lucretia led to her suicide. This scandal ignited outrage and gave birth to a revolution. Rome would never again tolerate a king. In place of monarchy rose the Roman Republic, a system designed, at least in theory, to prevent tyranny by dividing power among multiple elected officials. This new republic was governed by a constitution, unwritten but deeply traditional, and led by 2 consuls who shared executive power. Below them was the Senate, a body of former magistrates and aristocrats who advised but, in reality, wielded immense influence. Popular assemblies gave some voice to the plebeians, the commoners, who over time fought bitterly for political rights in what became known as the conflict of the orders. Rome's expansion began humbly. In the early Republic, Rome was just one of many Latin cities vying for power in central Italy. It fought a series of wars to subdue nearby tribes, the Aequi, Volsci and Sabines, and entered into complex alliances with other Latin communities. These early wars were brutal, fought not for empire but survival. The Roman military in this era was a citizen army. made up of property-owning men who brought their own weapons and served without pay. But what set Rome apart was not just military skill. It was its uncanny ability to absorb the conquered. Roman citizenship, at first a fiercely guarded privilege, was gradually extended to allies and even some defeated foes. This inclusiveness, cautious and self-serving but real, allowed Rome to bind its empire with loyalty, not just fear. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had emerged as a dominant power in Latium, but the real test came from the north. The Gauls, fierce warriors from beyond the Alps, invaded Italy and in 390 BCE sacked the city of Rome. It was a humiliation that scarred the Roman psyche and taught an enduring lesson. Never again would Rome allow itself to be so vulnerable. In response, Rome reformed its army and redoubled its expansion. It conquered Etruscan cities to the north, Samnite hill tribes to the south, and built a web of colonies and roads that allowed for the rapid movement of troops. Rome's roads were not just engineering feats, they were arteries of control and conquest. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BCE, connected Rome to the southern port of Brundisium, and soon to the Greek cities of Magna Graecia. During this expansion, Rome developed the Manipular Legion, a flexible and formidable military unit. Divided into centuries and maniples, it could move across rough terrain and adapt in battle more effectively than the rigid phalanxes of Greece. Roman soldiers, trained, disciplined, and increasingly professional, became instruments of state policy. The legions did not just fight wars, they built roads, dug ditches, and established forts that would have become future cities. Rome's conquests were accompanied by a genius for diplomacy. After defeating a city or tribe, Rome often allowed it to keep its own laws and magistrates, while binding it to Rome through military obligations and trade. The Latin League was replaced by a patchwork of treaties, some granting full citizenship, others partial rights, that turned Italy into a mosaic of loyal allies. This system of integration was not perfect, but it gave Rome a manpower reserve unmatched by any other state in the Mediterranean. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome controlled nearly all of Italy. But empire, true empire, requires more than land. It requires confrontation with other empires. The first great test came from the Carthaginians, a maritime power based in North Africa, with colonies across the western Mediterranean. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, erupted over control of Sicily, and it introduced Rome to naval warfare on a grand scale. Carthage, with its centuries-old naval tradition, should have dominated, but Rome, with characteristic tenacity, built a fleet from scratch, learned from captured ships, and innovated with boarding devices like the corvus to turn sea battles into infantry skirmishes. The war dragged for over 2 decades, but Rome's relentlessness paid off. Carthage sued for peace, ceding Sicily, Rome's first overseas province. With this victory, Rome transformed from a land-based Italian power into a Mediterranean force. It imposed tribute, established governors, and set the precedent for future provinces. The Punic Wars would define Rome's imperial trajectory. After a second and far more terrifying war, the Second Punic War, Rome would emerge not just victorious, but dominant across the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars were not merely a clash between two powers. They were an existential crucible that forged Rome into an imperial machine. The Second Punic War, in particular, would sear itself into the Roman imagination for centuries. It began in 218 BCE, when Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general of fierce genius, led his army, elephants and all, over the Alps into Italy. It was a move no Roman had anticipated, and for nearly 2 decades it plunged the Republic into terror. Hannibal's early victories were devastating. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most infamously at Cannae in 216 BCE, he annihilated Roman armies. Cannae alone may have seen over 50,000 Romans killed, one of the worst defeats in military history. Rome's allies began to waver, and its survival seemed uncertain. But Rome, stubborn and unyielding, refused to negotiate. Instead, it raised more armies, recalled experienced commanders, and harassed Hannibal's supply lines while avoiding direct battle. That strategy, attrition and patience, eventually turned the tide. One general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, took the war to Spain, severing Carthage's access to reinforcements. Then he sailed to North Africa and forced Hannibal to return home. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio, now titled Africanus, defeated Hannibal, ending the war and breaking Carthage's power. The Second Punic War fundamentally altered Rome. It had survived the worst and emerged stronger. Carthage was stripped of its navy, territory, and independence. Spain became a Roman province, rich in silver mines and manpower. The Mediterranean was no longer a frontier, it was becoming a Roman lake. But the Punic threat was not yet dead. In 149 BCE, Roman paranoia, fueled by hawks like Cato the Elder, erupted into the Third Punic War. The conflict was short but brutal. After a 3-year siege, Rome breached Carthage's walls in 146 BCE, razed the city, enslaved its population, and symbolically sowed salt into the earth. Whether that last act happened is debated, but it reflects Rome's desire not just to win, but to obliterate threats. Even as Rome waged war in the west, it turned eastward. The Hellenistic kingdoms, remnants of Alexander the Great's empire, had grown rich and fractious. Rome first entered Greece under the banner of liberation. In 1970 BCE, after defeating Philip V of Macedon at Cynocephalae, the Roman general Flamininus proclaimed at the Isthmian Games that Greece was free. The crowd erupted, but few understood that Rome was not there to liberate forever. Within decades, Rome had fought 3 Macedonian wars, culminating in the crushing of King Perseus at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE. Macedon was divided into puppet republics and later annexed as a province. In 146 BCE, the same year Carthage fell, Corinth was sacked and burned to the ground as a warning to all Greek cities. The Hellenistic world had been brought under Roman shadow. In Asia Minor, Rome fought the Seleucid king Antiochus III in the Syrian War, 192 to 188 BCE. After defeating him at Magnesia, Rome imposed a harsh peace and allowed its ally Pergamum to control much of Anatolia. When the last king of Pergamum died without an heir, he willed his kingdom to Rome, and the province of Asia was born. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome controlled territories across Italy, Spain, North Africa, Greece, and western Anatolia. It had become an empire in all but name, yet it retained its republican facade. The Senate ruled, consuls rotated annually, and provincial governors were drawn from Rome's aristocracy. But the system designed for a city-state, was buckling under the weight of empire. Provincial administration was inconsistent. Governors, often far from oversight, grew corrupt and rapacious. They extracted taxes, exploited local populations, and returned to Rome with wealth to fund political careers. This influx of riches, from grain, slaves, and tribute, transformed the Roman economy and society. The old agrarian citizen-soldier was being replaced by a new reality. Small farmers, called to fight in foreign wars, returned to find their lands neglected or sold. Wealthy elites bought up these plots to create vast estates, latifundia, worked by slaves. The Italian countryside emptied of free peasants and filled with bonded labour. Meanwhile, cities swelled. Rome itself grew from a modest city of a few 100,000 to over 1 million inhabitants by the end of the Republic. The urban poor, the capit censi, or head counts, had little property but growing political importance. They were courted with bread and spectacle, subsidised grain and gladiatorial games to win their votes in the assemblies. The army too changed. Originally composed of landowners, the legions increasingly relied on the urban poor, who enlisted for pay, plunder, and the promise of land. This shift would have profound consequences. Soldiers' loyalties began to move from the Republic to their generals, men who could reward them, protect them, and lead them to glory. These trends, economic inequality, military reform, and political dysfunction, fed into a growing crisis. The Senate, dominated by conservative aristocrats, resisted reforms that might ease inequality. Reformers like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to redistribute land, extend citizenship, and reduce corruption. Both were killed. Tiberius clubbed to death in 133 BCE, Gaius driven to suicide a decade later. Violence, once unthinkable in Roman politics, had now become a tool of statecraft. Factions formed. The Optimates, defenders of senatorial privilege, and the Populares, who appealed directly to the masses. The balance of power wavered. The Senate could no longer control ambitious generals, and the assemblies were increasingly manipulated by demagogues. Rome had gained the world, but lost its stability. The expansion of empire had brought extraordinary wealth, but also deep divisions. The Republic, proud, austere, and built for a city, was cracking under imperial strain. Soon it would give way to civil wars, strongmen, and ultimately, emperors. But the empire, the territories, the people, the infrastructure, would endure. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome had conquered a Mediterranean's worth of provinces, but it had not yet conquered itself. The Republic, once a model of checks, balances, and civic virtue, had become a stage for ambition, inequality, and bloodshed. Expansion had enriched the senatorial elite, displaced the small farmers, and emboldened generals who now wielded more power than the state that commissioned them. The cracks first widened under Gaius Marius, a novus homo, or new man, from a non-patrician background. In 107 BCE, Marius rose to consulship on the back of military success and populist support, but it was his military reforms that rewrote Rome's future. He opened the army to the landless poor and promised them pensions in the form of land, effectively professionalizing the legions and binding soldiers' loyalty to their general, not the Republic. Marius's reforms made the army more efficient, but more dangerous. Generals now had private armies. When the Senate failed to honour land grants, soldiers looked to their commanders to force the issue. Rome had created legions that could make or unmake kings. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician rival of Marius, soon took advantage of this new dynamic. In 88 BCE, after the Senate reassigned a military command from him to Marius, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome itself. The city fell without a fight. It was the first time Roman legions had been used not to expand borders, but to seize power within them. Civil war followed. Marius briefly retook the city, then died. Sulla returned and conducted a brutal purge, posting proscription lists of enemies who could be killed on sight. As dictator, he restructured the Republic to empower the Senate and weaken the assemblies. Then, remarkably, he retired. But the precedent was set. Power belonged to those with armies, not offices. In the wake of Sulla's reforms, the Republic limped on, hollowed out, technically intact, but increasingly unable to govern its own greatness. Amid this fragile peace emerged three men, whose ambitions would upend the Roman world: Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Pompey was Rome's most celebrated general, having cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and subdued the east from Judea to Armenia. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus. Caesar, though initially the least powerful, had the sharpest mind and deepest hunger. In 60 BCE, the three formed the first triumvirate, an unofficial alliance that bypassed the Senate and pooled influence. Caesar took Gaul, Crassus marched east, and Pompey governed Spain. But power sharing in Rome was rarely stable. Crassus died in 53 BCE at Carrhae, his army annihilated by Parthians. Without him, the balance broke. Pompey aligned with the Senate, who feared Caesar's rising popularity. In 49 BCE, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Instead, he crossed the Rubicon. The phrase still echoes today, a point of no return. Caesar marched south with a single legion, igniting civil war. Pompey fled, but Caesar pursued and defeated him in 48 BCE at Pharsalus. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered. Caesar followed, becoming entangled in Egyptian politics and famously allying with Cleopatra VII. Returning to Rome, Caesar was now unrivaled. He was appointed dictator for life, reformed the calendar, centralized governance, and began reshaping the state in his image. Yet his swift rise bred resentment. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, a group of senators, including former allies like Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him on the Senate floor. They believed they were saving the Republic. Instead, they plunged it into further chaos. The power vacuum left by Caesar's death led to another civil war. On one side were the assassins, the liberators. On the other, Caesar's supporters, especially his grand-nephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus. Octavian was just 18 at Caesar's death, but proved politically astute. He formed the second triumvirate with Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. Together, they defeated the liberators at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, but like all Roman alliances, theirs frayed. Lepidus was sidelined. Antony aligned with Cleopatra and ruled from Egypt. To Rome, this smacked of betrayal. In 31 BCE, Octavian confronted Antony and Cleopatra at the naval battle of Actium. He emerged victorious. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, became a Roman province. Octavian returned to Rome not as a tyrant, but as a saviour. In 27 BCE, he restored the Republic in name, but retained real power. The Senate awarded him the title Augustus, the revered one. He held tribunician powers for life, commanded the legions, and controlled foreign policy. The Republic still had consuls and assemblies, but they answered to one man. This was the Principate, the first phase of the Roman Empire. Augustus styled himself princeps, or first citizen, not king or emperor, but the reality was clear. The Republic was dead. In its place stood an empire ruled from the Palatine Hill. Augustus was careful to avoid Caesar's mistakes. He maintained the illusion of republican governance, consulted the Senate, and avoided overt displays of monarchy. He reformed the army, established a permanent standing force, and placed loyal legions in the provinces. He created a civil service, improved infrastructure, and cultivated public morality through propaganda and law. Peace Pax Romana was now the state religion. Augustus famously said he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He closed the gates of the Temple of Janus, symbolic of war, for the first time in generations. Temples rose, aqueducts flowed, roads stretched across continents. The empire had structure, order, and purpose. But this peace was built on power, not consensus. The emperor's authority was rooted in the legions. The Senate had become decorative. Elections continued, but the outcomes were preordained. Augustus ruled until his death in 14 CE and was succeeded by his stepson Tiberius, proving that succession, while not hereditary in theory, could be dynastic in fact. The Roman Empire had begun. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind not just a new form of government, but a meticulously constructed framework that would define Roman imperial rule for centuries. The Senate declared him a god, setting a precedent for the imperial cult, a religious political institution that reinforced the divine status of the emperor and encouraged loyalty throughout the provinces. His adopted son Tiberius took the reins, not with the flair of Augustus, but with quiet efficiency. Tiberius was a capable administrator and military leader. Having served in campaigns across the Danube frontier, his rule lacked popularity but brought continuity. He maintained the core institutions Augustus established: the centralized bureaucracy, the standing army, and the principle of imperial control over the provinces. Under his administration, the empire remained stable, though his later years became marred by increasing paranoia and withdrawal from public life. The Julio-Claudian dynasty continued through figures as infamous as they are emblematic. Caligula, who followed Tiberius, reigned from 37 to 41 CE and was remembered for his eccentricity and cruelty. Though his early rule was marked by popular gestures, burning tax records, granting bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, it quickly degenerated into despotism. His assassination by his own guards was as much a political coup as an expression of despair. Claudius, his uncle, followed. An unlikely emperor due to his physical disabilities and scholarly nature, Claudius proved one of the more competent rulers of his age. He expanded the empire to include Britain in 43 CE, a significant move that required a massive logistical operation across the English Channel. He also worked to improve judicial systems and oversaw extensive construction projects, including aqueducts and roads that would last for generations. Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudians, ascended in 54 CE. His reign began with promise, guided by advisors like Seneca, but devolved into extravagance and authoritarianism. Nero is most famously, and perhaps unfairly, remembered for fiddling while Rome burned during the Great Fire of 64 CE. What is better substantiated is his persecution of Christians, his obsession with performance, and his eventual suicide in 68 CE after revolts and desertion by the Senate and military. The collapse of the Julio-Claudian line triggered the Year of the Four Emperors, a civil conflict in 69 CE that revealed both the fragility and the resilience of the Roman system. Galba, Otho, Vitellius all briefly held power before Vespasian, a general commanding legions in Judea, marched on Rome and took control. Vespasian's rise marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty and the further militarization of imperial succession. He and his sons, Titus and Domitian, brought renewed focus on infrastructure and public morale. The Colosseum, built atop the remains of Nero's private lake, symbolised the return of public entertainment and the empire's architectural prowess. The Flavians also advanced the concept of emperor as administrator. Vespasian restored finances strained by Nero's extravagance. Titus, though ruling briefly, handled disasters, the eruption of Vesuvius and a major fire in Rome, with admirable competence. Domitian, despite his authoritarian leanings, stabilised the frontier and revalued the currency. He also adopted the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, reflecting the increasing divinization of the imperial office. Under the subsequent Nerva-Antonine dynasty, Rome entered its apex. The emperors of this era, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, were known as the Five Good Emperors. These rulers exemplified effective governance, peaceful succession, often through adoption, and expansionist or consolidating policies that shaped the empire's height. Trajan, in particular, brought the empire to its greatest territorial extent. His conquest of Dacia, modern-day Romania, in 106 CE not only secured gold mines, but funded Rome's grand architectural achievements, Trajan's Column, his Forum, and expansive markets. His eastern campaigns briefly pushed Roman control into Mesopotamia, though these gains proved unsustainable. Hadrian, his successor, reversed much of this expansionist agenda. A philosopher-emperor, Hadrian emphasised consolidation. He built Hadrian's Wall in Britain to mark the empire's northernmost boundary, and travelled extensively, personally overseeing the administration of distant provinces. His reign was marked by monumental architecture, from the Pantheon's renovation to the Villa Adriana in Tivoli. These emperors governed not merely as autocrats, but as custodians of a vast interconnected system. The empire was a web of provinces, each with its own culture, economy, and military presence, but unified through Roman law, language, roads, and identity. Romanization, as historians term it, was the process by which provincial populations came to adopt Roman customs, dress, language, primarily Latin, though Greek remained dominant in the East, and even names. This was not imposed uniformly. In many cases, it was aspirational. Local elites often sought Roman citizenship, which conferred legal privileges and social status. This incentive spurred cooperation rather than rebellion. By the 2nd century CE, Roman citizenship had become a powerful unifying force. In 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla would grant it to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, a move that further diluted distinctions between centre and periphery and facilitated taxation. Governance depended on layered administration. At the top were imperial provinces, directly controlled by the emperor and overseen by governors, often with military authority. Senatorial provinces, by contrast, were more pacified and administered through traditional channels. Cities had councils, magistrates, and officials who handled local matters, taxes, and public works. These local leaders were often drawn from Romanized elites. Communication and control were maintained through a remarkable road system, over 400,000 kilometers by the empire's height. Roads were laid in straight lines, stone paved, and designed for legions to march or messengers to travel with speed. Way stations allowed for rest and relays, while milestones recorded distances. This infrastructure was not merely military, it facilitated trade, migration, and administrative reach. Economically, the empire thrived on a mix of agriculture, slavery, and taxation. The provinces sent grain, oil, wine, metals, and taxes to Rome. Egypt, for example, was a granary, Spain a source of silver, the East a fountain of luxuries like silk and spices. Trade routes stretched from Britain to India, passing through ports, roads, and caravan cities like Palmyra and Petra. The coinage system helped unify markets. The denarius, introduced under Augustus, remained a stable silver standard for 2 centuries. Coins were struck with the emperor's image, reinforcing their authority in every transaction. Culturally, Rome remained a melting pot. Temples to Jupiter stood alongside shrines to Isis and Mithras. The imperial cult unified diverse regions through a common religious political bond. Loyalty to the emperor was expressed through ritual offerings, festivals, and temples, especially in the provinces. In cities, Roman architecture dominated skylines. Forums, basilicas, amphitheatres, aqueducts, and bathhouses. These were not just buildings, but instruments of Roman identity. The architecture declared, in stone, who ruled and what values mattered: order, leisure, cleanliness, and spectacle. At the family level, Roman values centred on pietas, duty to family, gods, and Rome. Paterfamilias controlled the household. Education emphasised rhetoric, law, and civic participation, though mostly for boys. Slavery remained foundational, with millions of enslaved individuals serving as labourers, teachers, doctors, and gladiators. Roman law evolved into a sophisticated system of codified principles. Legal precedent, contracts, inheritance rights, and property laws were standardised across the empire. Even today, modern legal traditions borrow from these early innovations. Religion evolved too. The polytheistic pantheon of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and others remained dominant, but mystery religions, such as those of Cybele, Mithras, and eventually Christianity, began to spread. Some offered salvation, others fellowship or emotional fulfillment beyond traditional rites. Entertainment, though, remained a constant. Gladiatorial games, chariot races at the Circus Maximus, theatrical performances, and festivals provided not just leisure, but a means of reinforcing social hierarchy and imperial generosity. Bread and circuses kept the population content, or at least distracted. The provinces, though diverse, were stitched together by common systems. A Roman in Gaul and one in Syria would encounter familiar structures: roads, laws, coinage, and institutions. The empire's genius was not in obliterating cultures, but in organising them under a shared framework. By the time Marcus Aurelius took the throne in 161 CE, the Roman Empire had become the most extensive and administratively complex state the world had seen. Marcus, a Stoic philosopher, spent much of his reign at war on the northern frontier, but continued to uphold the values of his predecessors. His meditations, written in a soldier's camp, reflect the burden of leadership and the ideals of duty and temperance. His death in 180 CE marked the end of the Pax Romana. His son Commodus lacked the discipline of his father. The transition revealed a central weakness of the empire, the lack of a consistent, peaceful system for imperial succession. Rome's strength lay in its roads, laws and legions, but its Achilles' heel remained the palace. Still, the empire endured. The groundwork had been laid, militarily, administratively, culturally. Rome was no longer a city-state conquering the world. It was the world, organised and named Roman. By the early 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire, though vast and culturally interwoven, was beginning to show signs of strain. Economic pressures, external invasions, and political instability combined to produce what modern historians refer to as the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 CE. It was a period marked by chaos, fragmentation, and near collapse. Yet it also set the stage for Rome's greatest reforms and final transformations as a political entity. The crisis began with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 CE. What followed was a near century of turbulence. Over 20 emperors were officially recognised in this period, but dozens more claimed power through military support. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, often the product of mutiny, assassination, or frontier rebellions. The army, once the instrument of imperial stability, became its own kingmaker. Legions declared their generals as emperors, setting off a pattern of civil war and betrayal. The Praetorian Guard, originally intended as a protective force, now routinely interfered in politics, deposing emperors at will and auctioning off the throne. At the same time, external threats grew. The Sassanid Empire in the east, under rulers like Shapur of Aachen, launched invasions into Roman territory, even capturing Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, a humiliation never before seen in Roman history. In the west, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube, raiding Gaul and northern Italy. Along the eastern frontiers, Palmyra emerged briefly as an independent power under Queen Zenobia, severing the eastern provinces from central Roman control. The economy faltered. With constant warfare and instability, trade routes suffered. Inflation soared as emperors debased the currency to fund military campaigns. Agricultural productivity declined in some areas, and tax burdens grew more desperate and uneven. Coinage lost its silver content, localized economies reverted to barter, urban centres declined, public building projects halted, law enforcement weakened. Even the Roman roads, long the veins of imperial life, became less secure as banditry and disruption increased. The ideological glue that had held the provinces loyal to Rome, order, protection, Roman identity, began to fray. And yet the empire did not fall. From within the crisis arose strong reformers, most notably Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 CE, inaugurated the most significant transformation of Roman governance since Augustus. His reign, 284 to 305 CE, did not simply patch up the empire, it restructured it fundamentally. Diocletian understood that the empire's size had become unmanageable under a single ruler. In response, he introduced the tetrarchy, the rule of four. The the empire was divided into two halves, east and west. Each half had an Augustus, senior emperor, and a Caesar, junior emperor. Diocletian ruled the east, Maximian the west. Two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, served as their deputies and successors. This division was not a fragmentation, but a deliberate administrative strategy. It allowed for quicker responses to threats, shared military responsibilities, and regional governance without waiting for directives from Rome. Each ruler had their own capital, Nicomedia in the east, Mediolanum, Milan, and later Trier in the west. Rome, though still symbolic, ceased to be the political heart. Diocletian also reformed the military. He expanded the size of the army and divided it into limitanae, border troops, and comitatenses, mobile field armies. This allowed for more flexible defence and rapid deployment. He strengthened frontier fortifications, reorganised provinces into smaller units to prevent governors from gaining too much power, and created dioceses, groupings of provinces overseen by vicari, streamlining control. The economy was also restructured. In 301 CE, Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, an attempt to curb inflation by setting limits on the prices of goods and services. Though largely ineffective and often ignored, it reflected the desire to control economic chaos. More consequential were the tax reforms. A census was conducted to more accurately assess land and labour, and taxes were increasingly paid in kind rather than in coin. Perhaps most symbolic of the transformation was Diocletian's self-image. Breaking with the earlier tradition of emperors as first among equals, Diocletian adopted the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This was the dominate, replacing the more subtle principate. He dressed in gold robes, distanced himself from the Senate, and emphasised imperial majesty. The emperor was no longer merely the state's administrator. He was its earthly embodiment of cosmic order. In 305 CE, Diocletian voluntarily abdicated, an extraordinary act. He retired to a palace in modern-day Split, Croatia. But the system he left behind soon unravelled. Succession disputes resumed, and civil war followed. From the ashes of these conflicts rose Constantine. Constantine the Great, of 306 to 337 CE, is best known for two monumental shifts: the reunification of the empire under a single ruler, and the legalization and later promotion of Christianity. Constantine, the son of Constantius, was proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain. He fought a series of wars against rival claimants, culminating in the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. According to Christian tradition, he received a divine vision in hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will conquer, and marched under the Christian Chi-Rho symbol. He won decisively. The following year, in 313 CE, Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians. This marked the end of systematic persecution and the beginning of Christianity's ascent as a dominant force in Roman life. Constantine did not immediately ban paganism. Indeed, he continued many traditional rites, but his favour toward Christianity shaped the trajectory of Western civilization. In administrative terms, Constantine continued Diocletian's reforms, but with new innovations. He created a new eastern capital, Constantinople, built on the site of Byzantium. Completed in 330 CE, it was a Christian city, heavily fortified and ideally located between Europe and Asia. Its foundation symbolised the shifting centre of imperial power toward the east, a trend that would define the remainder of Roman history. Constantine also reformed the coinage, introducing the solidus, a high-quality gold coin that would remain stable for centuries and become a basis for medieval European currencies. The bureaucracy grew. Civil and military offices were separated. New layers of oversight, comites and magistri officiorum, emerged to manage imperial affairs. The empire now resembled a highly structured, militarized, theocratic monarchy. But Constantine's greatest legacy was unintentionally future-altering. He laid the groundwork for a Christian empire. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, attempting to resolve theological disputes within the Church. The Nicene Creed emerged from this council, shaping Christian orthodoxy. The emperor had become not only a ruler of territory, but a patron of doctrine. After Constantine's death, his sons divided the empire again, and the 4th century witnessed a gradual drift between east and west. The western half faced increasing pressure from migrating and invading groups, Goths, Vandals, Franks. In 378 CE, the Eastern Emperor Valens died at the Battle of Adrianople against the Visigoths, a major blow that showed Roman vulnerability. In the West, administration weakened. Local aristocrats held more sway, and the city of Rome, though still symbolically important, lost practical control. Ravenna became the imperial capital in the West by the early 5th century. The East, by contrast, held firm. The administrative systems of Diocletian and Constantine had been fully internalized. Constantinople became the heart of a thriving, if embattled, Eastern Roman world. By the late 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were closed or repurposed. The public rituals of old Rome faded, replaced by bishops, churches, and creeds. The spiritual heart of the empire had changed. Yet beneath the surface, the empire still relied on older structures. Roman law continued to develop, codified later in the Theodosian Code, and eventually in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Roman roads, cities, and infrastructure remained the skeleton on which late antiquity and the medieval world were built. In the West, the final century saw accelerating decline. Rome was sacked in 410 CE by the Visigoths under Alaric, a shocking event that, while not fatal, shattered the illusion of invulnerability. Later, in 455 CE, the Vandals sacked the city again. In 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But this fall was not the end of Rome. In the east, the Roman Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years. Known to modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, it retained Roman law, Roman institutions, and Roman identity, though transformed by Greek language and Orthodox Christianity. Thus the Roman Empire, as an institution, proved astonishingly resilient. From a city on the Tiber to a world-spanning state, from a republic of citizen farmers to an imperial theocracy of emperors and bishops, it evolved to meet each century's demands. Its greatest strength was adaptation, military discipline, legal innovation, and cultural inclusivity. Rome did not merely conquer the Mediterranean, it organised it. And in doing so, it built not just an empire of territories, but an empire of systems. Its laws would influence Europe for centuries. Its roads would shape trade and communication. Its architecture, language, and religion would echo through Christendom and beyond. Even after its political power faded in the West, its memory persisted. In the dreams of Charlemagne, in the coronations of Holy Roman emperors, in the orthodox liturgies of Byzantium, and in the very idea of Europe as a civilizational project. The Roman Empire was not eternal, but it was foundational, and through its centuries of expansion, reform, crisis and transformation, it left behind the blueprint of empire itself.